And yet she made the time to be here with us today, to speak truthfully, to name sins for what they are, and to take part in our conversation about choices, decisions, and responsibility. Please join me in welcoming our distinguished keynote speaker, Kateryna Zarembo.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, it is my great honor to be here today. Thank you very much, Lviv Media Forum, for your invitation. If there is a shelling, jump out and run to the sideway. That's where you can take shelter, said the crew commander. I nod silently. Just half an hour ago, I desperately wanted to sleep. Now my head is clear from adrenaline. We are heading out to evacuate the wounded. The Russians are tracking the evacuation vehicles. The international humanitarian law, including the Geneva Conventions, prohibits attack on medical personnel. But the Russians have never respected international conventions. Evacuation cars and stabilization points are their primary targets. Not only do they aim to kill the wounded, but also condemn the next ones to death. There will be no one to help them. The armored vehicle passing out the casualties has been targeted multiple times. Despite the fact that we are moving in the direction of the enemy, there is no point in fear. It consumes your energy, dilutes the focus. In order to do your job, you must put the fear aside. The focus theme of this year's Media Forum is name things for what they are, speak the unspoken. And I see it as an invitation for an honest conversation without fear or self-censorship. I would like to start out with asking you a question. Do you believe in democracy as a value? I'd like to see if you do. You may raise your hand. Do you believe that democracy is a good thing? Okay, I'm happy that this question is still uncontroversial. Well, if then, how do you practice it? I think that after over 11 years of Russia's war against Ukraine, no one needs to explain anymore that this is a war the war not only for Ukraine's independence and freedom, but for the entire free world. The war of autocracy against democracy. And that means that this is also your war. The war continues even if you cannot see it. Shelling still occurs in what we conditionally consider rear towns and cities, and the victims resulting from shelling of the territories close to the front line often do not even make it to the news headlines. Just yesterday, for example, in Donetsk Oblast, there was one civilian person killed and 7 injured, and you can only see it from local news. Any peace agreement, if one is reached, will only be temporary, because Russia is not interested in peace. This war will persist as long as Russia exists in the form in which we know it, because war is the essence of its existence. This is the country which has always fought wars in different parts of the world. If we just take the time period after 1991 as Chechnya, Georgia, Moldova, Syria, this is the country which committed war crimes in Mali and Libya, the country which has believed in its own immunity for the consequences of the war crimes. Recently, the body of Ukrainian journalist Victoria Roshina was returned to Ukraine. She was captured by Russia in October 2023. She was tortured with electric shocks, had her ribs broken, and was fed rotten food. By summer 2024, Victoria weighed only 30 kilos and could not stand on her feet due to exhaustion and illness. In the fall of that year, she died in captivity, having not survived to the planned exchange. When her body was brought to Ukraine, pathologists observed that her brain, eyeballs, and part of her trachea had been removed. Doctors believe this was done to conceal the cause of death, suffocation. If it is difficult for you to hear this, imagine how hard it is to live through this. Today, 16,000 Ukrainians are still in Russian captivity. Right now, this very moment, they are enduring torture. Those I just mentioned, or much worse. And that's not all. I have yet to speak about life in occupation, an everyday exhausting ordeal, about the kidnapping and forced re-education of Ukrainian children, about the executions of the Ukrainian prisoners of war right on the battlefield. This is only a part of inhumane crimes committed by Russia, and it continues to do so in this very moment. You might ask, what can I do? I have a few pieces of advice for you. First, do not limit your imagination. The only thing truly holding back our possibilities is the boundaries of our imagination. Ukraine's history is a continuous story of how others did not believe in us, but we succeeded anyway. This is not only about the prophecy Ukraine will fall in 3 days, which Western media repeated as a mantra in the weeks before the full-scale invasion. Providing Ukraine with Patriot air defense systems, ATACMS missiles and F-16 fighters, stopping Nord Stream, freezing Russian assets, or granting candidate status to the European Union, to Ukraine to join the European Union. All of this seemed impossible to you just a few years ago. 40 years ago, even the very idea of an independent Ukraine seemed utopian. Abroad, only a handful of dreamers believed in it. I urge you to believe that the deoccupation of Ukraine, de-imperialization and de-armament of Russia, holding Russians accountable for war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, are all possible. And when there is a will, there is a way. I can also assure you that Ukraine will continue to fight and defend itself. Oh, you see, slip of the tongue, Freudian, yourself as well, even if the United States completely withdraws its support. And if we do this together with our partners, even limited to the coalition of the willing, we will be invincible. Second, if you think you are not doing enough, I'm urged to ask you raise your hands, but I will not. Do more. I do not necessarily mean going to the front lines, although this could be a path for some of you, even if you're not Ukrainian citizens. During the war, I have met many dedicated foreigners who fight in the ranks of the Ukrainian army. I am primarily talking about your conscience. It does not lie. The truth is, you can do enough. Enough within the possibilities of your life and the scope of your personality. Your conscience will tell you when you reach this point, when you can tell yourself in all honesty, I am doing the most I can. I would like to quote here Ukrainian journalist Kateryna Zarembo. The full-scale war has shown that all these balances, you first, choose yourself, are bullshit. Now that choice remains. Millions have looked after themselves and their loved ones first, and others have taken care of their well-being, future, lives, property, and health. Those who every day put the oxygen masks on others rather than themselves. Thanks to their sacrifices, the physical war is happening where it is, and thousands or tens of thousands still live at home or have managed to leave. Their homes here are worth something and are even being sold. Their elderly parents are not in occupation. In other words, including the words of my dear friend, writer Sasha Dovzhik, you cannot save the world by choosing yourself. If you live abroad, you can also do a lot. It's not only about supporting Ukraine through the established ways, volunteering, donations, participating in demonstrations, but also, very importantly, influencing the politics in your countries. Vote for politicians who support democracy and the rule of law, rather than the law of the strong. Talk to your relatives and neighbors. Explain to them why Russia's war against Ukraine, against the free world, concern them personally. Third, if you don't know how to do something, and this is the conversation I would often have with my Ukrainian compatriots, but I think it can be also applicable to our international friends and partners. If you don't know how to do something, learn. At the minimum, basic combat training is the least that citizens of Ukraine and other European democracies should undertake. But definitely not only this. Millions of Ukrainians previously did not know how to sew camouflage nets, repair drones, or understand the types of electronic warfare. Most of the Ukrainian army are not professional soldiers. They learned everything from scratch. If a few years ago someone told me I would be able to give injections, work with blood, or even that the sight of an amputated limb would not terrify me, I would never have believed it. Sometimes I hear people say, I couldn't do that. You could, if you believed it was necessary. The only thing I cannot and do not want to get used to is human suffering. We have the power to stop it, here in Ukraine and elsewhere. Fourth, as a writer, I cannot help but mention literature, and my advice is simple and complex at the same time. Read books. Read long texts. In an era of excessive information, bots, and artificial intelligence, mass manipulation becomes even easier through short messages that stir emotions and distract from analysis. Practice concentration. A person accustomed to following a storyline can more easily recognize lies, manipulations, and inconsistencies that dishonest people use. For us Ukrainians, reading during the war has also become an act of resistance. Ukrainian children in occupation secretly study using Ukrainian textbooks. Recently, many were struck by yet another story of a Ukrainian child, let's call her Sofia, a teenager who lived in occupation for 10 years, and escaped from the occupied Donetsk as soon as she turned 18 and gained the right to travel unaccompanied. Besides her local school, she secretly studied remotely in a Ukrainian school in Slovyansk. Can you imagine the strength of a spirit a child might have to secretly resist for years in an atmosphere of fear, propaganda, and lack of freedom, without even being able to tell their inner circle? Recently, British journalists also reported on the most dangerous book club in the world, teenagers' clandestine meetings in Mariupol, where they read Ukrainian literature in secret from the occupiers. Russia understands the power of the Ukrainian word, which is why they systematically and purposefully destroy Ukrainian libraries. According to the data from last year, Russia destroyed or damaged nearly 1,000 Ukrainian libraries containing over 200 million books. This means that the voice of Ukrainian literature must be heard even louder. It would be wonderful if each of you left here from Lviv with a Ukrainian book or bought one translated into your language. Mention Ukrainian authors or the authors from other nations whom Russia silenced when people ask you for a reading advice. And finally, be humane and maintain empathy for yourself and others. Personally, I find this advice the most challenging because the temptation to retreat into your own bubble and distance yourself from the rest of the world is very strong. However, only those with strength of spirit can distinguish enemies from the opponents. Also, care to act and act to care. Evil is possible not only because criminals commit heinous acts, but also because of the inaction and silence of its witnesses. Kindness and impartiality are not an emotion. These are actions. The slogan of the Hospitaliers is for the sake of every life. This is my personal guideline. Whether it is a civilian or a soldier, young or old, strong or weak, every life is valuable. And this is what we often forget when, in the context of peace, we talk about territories, mineral reserves, Zelensky suit, anything but human life, safety, and dignity, whether on free Ukrainian territory, in occupation, or in captivity. And it is this that should be at the center of any negotiations. To conclude, I want to tell you a story shared with me by my colleague, a hospitalier with the call sign Rudy. In spring 2022, when the Russians hit one of the residential buildings, all its residents ran outside. Everyone except a 9-year-old boy. Remembering that a dog was locked inside the neighboring apartment, he went back, grabbed the keys from under the doormat, took the dog, and returned to the shelter with it. My friend, children's book author Kateryna Zarembo says, No one is too small to change the world for the better. And I infinitely agree with her. This phrase can have many variations. For example, no one lives too far away or is too busy to care. I would like to conclude with the words of Alexandra Matvichuk, Ukrainian human rights defender and Nobel Prize winner. You don't have to be a Ukrainian to support Ukraine. You just have to be a human. Thank you.
Thank you, Kateryna, for your meaningful contribution. And now it is my distinct honor to invite to the stage someone whose work shows that peace, reform, and economic strength are truly possible, even in the toughest circumstances. Our keynote speaker leads the Bret Hearst Foundation in Johannesburg, which works to support Africa's economic growth. He has helped governments in Rwanda, Mozambique, Malawi, and South Africa carry out reforms, and has also supported peace and investment efforts in Colombia and across Africa. Before this, he was the national director of the South African Institute of International Affairs and taught at the universities of the Western Cape and Cape Town. Please join me in warmly welcoming our distinguished keynote speaker, Dr. Greg Mills.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a great honor and a privilege to be here with you today. This is my 12th trip to Lviv since the war began. Many people, I'm from Johannesburg in South Africa, I was born in Cape Town. Many people say, why does somebody from South Africa spend so much effort? And it's not an easy trip, as you will appreciate, to get here. So much effort on the issue of Ukraine. And the answer was really given by the previous speaker, who I thought was absolutely excellent and riveting, and very humbling. And that is because your struggle is our struggle. If Ukraine has to fail and Russia has to prevail, we are all going to be the losers. Democracy is in trouble in the world, and democracy is in trouble in Africa. It's a theme I will return to. And if democracy had to fail, and fear and repression and raw power was to prevail in these circumstances, lots of authoritarians would take support and encouragement from that. It would be a bad day for democrats and a great day for autocrats. I do believe it's absolutely necessary from a moral perspective to support Ukraine, but I do think that enlightened self-interest carries on beyond charity or beyond good feeling. And it's fundamentally in our enlightened self-interest to support your struggle. And I endorse wholeheartedly the words of the great Alexandra Matvichuk in saying, you just have to be human if you're going to support Ukraine. We have brought many African politicians to Ukraine over the last 3 years. We have visited very many corners of the country, from Kharkiv to Kherson, from Izium to Odessa. And all of them have been struck by the extraordinary fortitude of all Ukrainians, but especially young Ukrainians. As the father of 3 children, aged 23, 21, and 19, my hair used to be blonde, is now grey as a consequence. The future is yours. I can say that with some degree of certainty where I stand myself personally. And we absolutely have to make these investments in the nature of the world that we live in, that we confront, and also the nature of the societies in which we operate. Let me say that this is a profound moment to be here because it's 80 years since the most costly war in human history ended, during which some 75 million people died, including 25 million military personnel. Ukraine suffered an estimated 8 million deaths in that war, of which more than 5 million were civilians. That figure representing about 40% of the casualties of the entire Soviet Union. And if you add that to the 5 million or so who died during the Holodomor, these figures start to take on horrendous, enormous proportions. And now, 35 years since the end of the Cold War, since the suggestion that we had reached the end of history, with the culmination of that Cold War and the apparent victory of democracy over autocracy, history appears to be back and history appears to be moving very fast. The democratic world has been shaken by an arc of crisis which doesn't only affect Ukraine, but is cutting across the Sahel region of Africa into the Middle East as well, for example. And three big questions stand out at the cusp, on the cusp of this 80th anniversary. What are the lessons, firstly, of the conflict, of the full-scale military invasion starting in 2022? Secondly, what are the options for peace, whether this be temporary or permanent? And thirdly, to invoke the terms of Michael Howard, Professor Sir Michael Howard, a grandfatherly figure in the field of strategic studies, which is my discipline, is there a theory of victory imaginable for Ukraine? Now, the first strategic lesson is by the measures or by the objectives set by Vladimir Putin to turn Ukraine very quickly into a Russian colony, effectively, and that this would take just a few days. Russia has lost and Ukraine has won. But even if the strategic victory is Ukraine's for now, and how the peace talks proceed and how Kiev uses any pause in that conflict, this is what will determine what will shape the end condition in which Ukraine emerges ultimately. The overall lesson of the war has to be that raw power is back. In other words, if you want peace, prepare for war, in supplanting international law as the organizing principle in international relations. I think it's optimistic to expect anything else constructive or anything at all to replace it anytime soon. And what this means in these circumstances, almost invariably, is that we turn to the region to be able to secure ourselves, to integrate ourselves more closely. The significant strategic lesson for the West is in the folly of not giving enough to Ukraine to win. Just enough not to lose, but never enough to win. And Western assistance to Ukraine has been equivalent to around 0.1% of Western GDP, which is a tiny amount given even defense expenditure of just 2%. The other strategic lessons include the folly of trusting Russia, even when it commits to doing certain things. Don't forget the Budapest Memorandum, for example. And also not to forget that it is going to almost invariably use spoiling tactics in any negotiations. I think there's a healthy skepticism also necessary about Western promises, based as it is on a yawning delivery credibility gap, self-interest, and the fickleness of democratic systems. Russia's war in Ukraine also reminds us that war on this scale is about economic as much as it is about military power and military health. And the strategic tools, therefore, include isolation and sanctions, even if this aspect has to be fully explored and applied. It would also, to do so, have to be applied on secondary markets, most notably China and perhaps even India. The last, I think, strategic message I would take from this is that Ukraine's message of human rights and liberal democracy, as much as it appeals to me personally, has lacked resonance among much of a world which is suspicious of the West and where the majority do not live in democracies. In my own continent, in Africa, while some 70% of people who are regularly surveyed on their attitudes about democracy prefer democracy to any other form of governance, 93% of Africans live under various forms of authoritarianism. So we are slowly losing the democratic battle where we once gained 30 years ago an increasing democratic space. It is a very contested area, and this message of democracy, while hopeful for many in the opposition, remains a dulled message for those in government. The governance component also has a global dimension. Authoritarians have proven very good at being able to stick together and in stoking the forces of liberalism. In Europe, in Europe, as well as further afield in my own continent and in Latin America. And this is why you have the Friends of Steel Pact, for example, involving China, among others. And this is why China today supplies about 2/3 of Russian machine tools and 90% of the computer chips acquired or used in Russian weaponry. There are many operational lessons which I can focus on, but I want to turn to a theory of peace, which I believe is more important. There is a presumption that President Putin will accept a permanent peace based on the conquests that he has already made in the East and in Crimea. But as my namesake, Gregory Nemeria, the Vice Chair of the Rada Foreign Affairs Committee, said to us earlier last week, he said, this is a war not about territory. After all, Russia is almost twice as large as the next country in the global system at 17 million square kilometers across 11 different time zones. It's a war about values. It's a war about questions and perceptions of security. There certainly, from my vantage at least, does not seem to be the conditions, and I'm echoing Kateryna's words here as well, for a permanent peace while Putin remains in place in Moscow. Not for a man who has pinned his honor, and indeed his office, on the re-establishment of the Russian Empire, and he has centered this struggle on Ukraine. Whatever might be agreed to at talks, whether in fact he attends talks, will almost certainly be used as an opportunity for Russia to pause and reconstitute itself and to have, as we would say in English colloquially, to have another go. And in this environment, three scenarios are imaginable, and I'll briefly go through them. The first of these is to give war another chance, to fight it, continue to fight it out. As Edward Luttwak, the American strategist, once said, you can't force a peace on circumstances where peace is not viable and where the underlying issues are unresolved. And in this circumstance, of course, it would be very necessary for Ukraine, if it was to continue to see itself supported by the international community, to be able to portray Russia as being the spoiler in any peace process. It would certainly have to work very hard to keep the United States on board and also to keep Europe on board as part of that process. In terms of a more permanent peace, there are essentially two options in this regard. The first of these is the so-called Korean model, as is signed in July 1953, in which option Ukraine would more or less get to keep its current territorial area and also its claims intact, but it would have to then focus on its own long-term economic, technological, and military improvement. Of course, in this scenario, in the Korean scenario, there's very little likelihood of reunification, as in fact has happened in Korea, but rather you would see a much stronger Ukraine within its current territory emerge, and there would be fewer of the prerequisites for who you might join and when you might join them as well. The second is the so-called German option, where of course there's a big difference with Germany because you're not a defeated nation by any means, but this would ostensibly involve a long period of division with the aim of eventual reunification, with multi-generational pressure being applied on Russia, both by Ukraine's relative success and Russia's relative failure, but also by Ukraine's success in rebuilding defenses. And one can imagine an entire list of things that would have to take place within this option, and indeed the Korean one, not least security guarantees, not least a peacekeeping force, not least probably accession to the EU for Ukraine, which implies certain formal guarantees, and so on. It would be very necessary in this to keep the idea that Ukraine is simply waiting it out before it can take on Russia once more, politically and diplomatically, if not militarily. And then finally is probably what I think may be the most likely option, if one was to discount the prospect of war simply continuing, and that is what one could call the Israeli option. And by that I don't mean bombing Gaza into smaller pieces. By that I mean using peace as an opportunity to rebuild your defenses, a short peace, a pause in the fighting, and being able to run a much more defensible structure to your defense force than is currently being possible under constant military attack and under constant political and military stress. This would be akin to how the British defeated the Japanese in World War II, essentially by degrading the opposition, but with the knowledge all along that a military solution was almost inevitable to this conflict, given Putin's ambitions, given Putin's expressed desire to recreate the Russian Empire. The key part about this is, of course, that Ukraine would have to rebuild its defenses and rebuild its armed forces. It would, in the words of my former boss in Afghanistan, General Nick Carter, have to make itself into an indefensible porcupine. A porcupine is an African animal with lots of quills. We have a house in a remote area. We see them very often, and they're not something that you want to tangle with. You don't want to be poking around with a porcupine. It can be very sore, and they will make your life a misery if you attempt to approach them. And Ukraine would have to make itself into that defensible porcupine in the process. At first glance, in conclusion, it seems that Putin's Russia has all the advantages. It has faster production of military means. It has deeper manpower, sources, and pockets. He has no need for consultation and agreement from allies, and he has no meddlesome domestic opposition. From this point of view, he would almost undoubtedly prefer to keep the conflict going. Conversely, President Zelensky could, and in my view, should move in the opposite direction and openly, as he has done with the Istanbul talks, sue for peace. And if Ukraine can manage an asymmetrical technological advantage in its defense forces and armed forces, such as through intelligence and drone hardware, he can deliver in this process more options to the defense of Ukraine. Putin's time advantage also has limits. Diplomatically, he's probably never going to be in a better position than he is now with Trump in Washington. But as time goes by, that advantage almost inevitably erodes. Plus, the European Union, like a giant waking from its slumbers, is slowly but surely gearing up. And it is my belief that Putin's positioning can be worsened by smart Ukrainian positioning and diplomacy. On the wider narrative, in areas like Africa, justice and courage are important, but ultimately they have little effect on governments. Sovereignty is the most powerful strategic play and strength. There is a parallel again with the plight of Israel. It moved from being a weak state with sympathy for the Zionist cause at the end of the Second World War and at the end of the Holocaust, to one that is much stronger today and which certainly is much less pitied, not least by Israeli actions. But as one person who was born in Ukraine and ultimately became the Prime Minister of Israel, Golda Meir, recalled, she said, if we have to have a choice between being dead and pitied and being alive with a bad image, we'd rather be alive and have the bad image. Putin's worst nightmare, ladies and gentlemen, and the organizers of this terrific conference, is that of authoritarians elsewhere. And that is to see a vibrant, free economy and free and open society thriving in Ukraine. That is precisely what he doesn't want, and that is precisely why I am personally, and the foundation that I represent, and the people who participate in the foundation are so interested in what happens in Ukraine. Putin's appeal to authoritarians rests precisely on undoing the rules-based international order and the alternative that his regime represents to democracy and its lack of commitment to transparency and accountability. All the things that I suspect that most people in this room would subscribe to. So Ukraine's narrative has to be different. Its narrative to the global south, of which South Africa is a member, and all of Africa indeed, has in this light to be driven by two qualities. One of these is empathy. We understand your struggles, which is why we want you to understand our struggles. We are interested in your struggles just as we want you to be interested in our struggles. But it's also to be defined not just by empathy, but by agency. That Ukraine is fighting a war against colonialism, is a force for good over evil, and is a global indicator for the health of democracy, and that it aims finally to put people first in politics. Not states, not interests, but putting people first in politics. Kateryna, in her speech, issued us with a challenge. I don't know if you realize this, but you said we must read books. Well, one of the things I do, mainly for my own therapy, is to write books. And last year I wrote a book on the art of war and peace, which is a result of all this engagement with Ukraine and indeed with other conflicts. And we've bought several copies with us, which I'm very happy to give away. But I'm also pleased because she pointed out that not only do we write things in English for outside audiences about Ukraine, but I really do believe in this issue of agency. I fundamentally believe in it. If you can't get insiders to act in a particular way, then don't expect outsiders to be able to get what they would like to see. And for that reason, that book was translated now into Ukrainian. This is the first copy, so I'm not giving it away. But I'm delighted. It's the first time I've ever been published in Ukrainian, and hopefully not the last time. But it's precisely those exchanges that'll make this a better world. Thank you very much.